Ms Campbell.
Mr Johnson, my name is Brenda Campbell and I ask questions on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved Families for Justice, which means that I ask questions on behalf of people who are members of a club that they never wished to be members of, but having become members by virtue of their bereavement, they have campaigned for this inquiry. They have listened intently to all the evidence, including yours, in search for answers. And I want you to understand that the questions that I ask are asked on their behalf. And so if I may, can I ask you please to answer with clarity and with brevity those questions on their behalf? To put it bluntly, Mr Johnson, where a one-word answer is sufficient, I'll take it. It's plain from your evidence today and yesterday that you have followed a great deal of the evidence at this inquiry and that Her Ladyship has heard. You told us yesterday that you have seen the impact video that was played at the start of this module, and the impact of long COVID was reflected powerfully in that. You'll also recall, having watched that it captured the experience of our client, Martina Ferguson, who lost her mother, Ursula Derry, on the 4th of January 2021. But can I ask you, have you also listened to and watched the oral evidence from the bereaved in this module and in Module 1?
No.
Well, the question might be, why not?
Because I'm afraid I haven't been able to watch all the evidence in this inquiry.
Had you watched it, in Module 1, you would have heard the evidence of Brenda Doherty about the loss of her mother, Ruth. And at the outset of this module on the 5th of October, you would have heard the evidence of Katrina Miles, who lost her father, Gerard McLarnon, 3 years ago, in fact, this month. And if you continue to listen to further modules, you'll hear stories of further bereavement that Her Ladyship has invited to be told, understanding the pain and the distress that families feel. But one of Miss Miles's points that she told us about was a galling juxtaposition of being told on the 18th of December 2020 that her father, aged 67, was going to die in the coming days from COVID, and that he died alone. His time of death is not known, 5 days later on the 23rd of December. The juxtaposition that she told us about, that in her words was sickening, was that on the 18th of December, there were one of several Christmas events in Downing Street and around the area to have taken place that month. This particular event was a wine and cheese party and a secret Santa during a so-called business meeting. Do you understand, and on behalf of the bereaved, really understand the idea that many of those who were denied the possibility of saying goodbye to loved ones, whilst at the same time those making the draconian rules were to be seen to be flouting them, is, as Miss Miles told us, galling and sickening? Do you understand that?
Thank you. And the short answer is, as I told the chairman of the inquiry, yes, I do understand people's pain and people's offence, of course.
You see, sadly, her experience and that of her family is far from unique. The revelations of the unlawful parties and gatherings in Downing Street have, as Her Ladyship has acknowledged this morning, compounded the distress and the grief felt by families who were denied the opportunity either to say a final goodbye, or to host a wake, or to host a funeral for their loved ones. If you do understand that, as you tell us you do, why was it allowed to happen?
Thank you. I've extensively tried to explain how I think that came about and why I think the people who were working in Downing Street for a very long time and very hard believed that they were working within the rules at the time. Though, as I say to you to those you represent, and again to Mane. I understand fully the point that you are making, and I regret it very much.
I'm going to move on from this topic, but it's perhaps important to note that by the 18th of December 2020, there had been 86,886 COVID-related deaths that year. This, I'm going to suggest, is not a matter of hindsight. It was plain that the country and that those who were bereaved were in extreme pain and distress. Could you have done more to stop it?
To stop the pandemic?
The gatherings, the Partygate, the wine and cheese parties, the Secret Santas, the pub quizzes or the Zoom quizzes.
I had no knowledge of the event on the 18th at the time.
That was not my question.
At the time that it took place.
Could you have done more to stop it?
I think that the trouble was, as I've said, that people were working extremely hard in
Mr. Johnson, I'm going to. We've heard that.
If I'd had
my question is,
sorry, please go ahead.
And this may be one where a yes or no answer would suffice. Could you have done more to stop it?
I think the answer to that is that, given what I knew at the time about what was going on, the answer to that is no. But what I possibly should have done is issued a general instruction to everybody to be mindful of the rules and how things would appear. And as I say, I think in one of the WhatsApps that was earlier quoted by the counsel to the inquiry, that's my view.
That WhatsApp was dated almost exactly 1 year later, on the 17th of December 2021.
Ms Campbell, you need to move on.
I'm
You've gone beyond
on.
my permitted
Yes.
questions already.
On the keeping on the theme, if we may, of perhaps not doing quite enough, may I return to the issue of your communications with the devolved administrations? And you touched on this yesterday. You told us why, in your view, COBRAs at which the leaders of the devolved administrations attended were not working, and we heard about the concern of leaks and so on. But you knew when COBRAs were stopped in May 2020 that left no formal means by which you could meet the leaders of the devolved administrations in the middle of this global pandemic. You understood that, didn't you?
I don't think that's quite true. There were obviously plenty of opportunities in which I could meet the leaders of the devolved administrations. I had excellent relations both with Michelle and Arlene Foster, but as the inquiry has heard, we tried to split the labour.
Well, in fact, the decision, if you call it to split the labour, and the consequence of it was that between May and October, September 2020, you didn't have any direct meetings with the leaders of the devolved administrations. That's a fact.
Well, meetings themselves were quite difficult.
Well, but the point that I'm making to you, Mr. Johnson, is that the point of stopping the COBRAs and replacing them with Four Nations calls at which you would not be present nor participate was a deliberate decision to manage the devolved administrations.
It was my judgment that the DAs, with whom we had excellent relations, and I think that overwhelmingly things worked well across the UK. But I thought that the CDL was well placed to deal with them, and he did.
So the answer to my question, that it was a deliberate decision, is yes.
Yes.
And it was deliberate because, we've heard yesterday, it was, in your view at the time, optically wrong. It was, as you told us in your statement, more importantly because you, in that way, would not be communicating directly with the First Minister of Scotland. And it was deliberate, I think, as you told us yesterday, in order to have a mechanism that would avoid leaks or so-called divergence. But there was an opportunity, wasn't there, for some form of what you called integrated decision-making and direct communications that was, as you told us yesterday, in hindsight, desirable. But you opted not to take it. and that was the Joint Ministerial Committee. Do you agree? You opted not to take it deliberately.
I think the problem with and I remember we covered this yesterday, the problem with that particular approach was that it was still vulnerable to some of the weaknesses you've just mentioned.
The benefit of that particular approach is that it would have been an independent stream, a committee chaired by you, in which you would have met and discussed with the leaders of the devolved administrations the great crisis that this country was facing at the time. It may have been constitutionally weird, to use your word from yesterday, or perhaps even imperfect, but it was an option available to you, wasn't it?
Yes, that's certainly correct, though I want to stress that I think that the overwhelming result of the cooperation we had with the DAs was very productive and harmonious.
Your evidence yesterday, Mr Johnson, was that perhaps you should have done more on reflection.
I think what I said was that I would like what we need is some sort of leak-proof integrated system. That's the grail.
Well, surely what you needed was better forms of direct communications with the leaders of the devolved administration in an environment that best benefited communication across all of the devolved administrations.
I think we had excellent communications across all of the DAs, and I think that the overall performance of the UK in the pandemic as a single entity was remarkable, and every part of the UK played an important part in the effort. If you look at it, there was a huge amount of joined up work going on across the whole country.
Well, what credence then do you give to the complaints coming from the leaders of the devolved administrations, and I mean across the board, not just in Northern Ireland, of a high-handed, incommunicative approach from Westminster?
Well, I don't recognise that version of events.
So, just to be clear, you reject the idea of a high-handed, incommunicative approach by Westminster as complained about by the devolved administration?
I do, and I think that we had a huge amount of contact between Number 10 and the DAs, between central government and the DAs, and every effort was made to bring along everybody together.
I'm going to move on, if I may, then, to what you suggested in your statement was a way in which we could have brought everybody together, and that is your proposal for a pan-UK Civil Contingencies Act. Although that is the position in your statement, should we understand that your updated position is that there are powerful arguments against that proposal?
I've noticed in the course of these excellent hearings and the discussion that's gone on that people think that the CCA is not the right framework. I'm listening to that. I think that maybe something could be done under the 1984 Public Health Act, as I think I said yesterday. Somehow or other, I think we need to recognise that a pandemic presents a particular problem for the whole of a cross-boundary problem for the whole of the UK, and that there needs to be some sort of a way of making sure that our messages are united. That was the point I was making, and I'm sure the inquiry will attach whatever importance to this it thinks is right. But I felt during the course of the pandemic occasionally that messages were being blurred and people were being confused because of a succession of press conferences from different parts of the UK. Now, I may have been super sensitive to that, but I was getting quite a lot of echo about that.
Well, time permitting, I'd like to ask you some questions about that at the end, but just dealing with the issue of Pan-UK Civil Contingencies Act, you obviously now realise that your proposal for such a Pan-UK Act achieved relatively rare cross-party unity in Northern Ireland against that proposal. In fact, it was the united view that there is a need for a bespoke and devolved level response to the pandemic to take into account each administration's social political landscape. And you must surely agree, Mr Johnson, that given the regional and indeed significant geographical differences, particularly for the north of Ireland and the epidemiological reality of the island of Ireland, that any pandemic response must allow for regional flexibility and divergence.
Yes, I see that argument. I think we've had quite a lot of discussion this morning about the downsides of regional divergence and the downsides of different parts of the country taking a different approach. I think that was there was quite a lot about that this morning.
The discussion this morning focused on the difference between Devon and Cornwall and the West Midlands or further north. I'm asking you questions on behalf of the citizens of the bereaved families of Northern Ireland. Do you not agree that particularly when it comes to the north of Ireland, on the island, that there is a need to recognise the particular geographical and regional features of that place?
So when it comes to Northern Ireland, yes, clearly you're right. There's we have to take account of the greater epidemiological unity of the island of Ireland, and what you say has force.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
But, I still think that there's you asked generally about the DAs. I think the more unified we can be, the better.
Well, of course, but the suggestion of unity and of an integrated approach led by Westminster, be it either written in statute or achieved by more meaningful and direct communication, must assume, mustn't it, that Westminster is capable of real leadership, both in public and behind closed doors, and it is capable of taking timely and proportionate action in response to the pandemic in all corners of the UK.
And indeed, that's what Westminster did. And I remember vividly going to Northern Ireland in early 2021 and seeing how very, very much faster the vaccines were being rolled out in Northern Ireland than they were in, and nobody will thank me for saying it, but I've got to say it, than they were over the border in the EU. And there are reasons for that. And I think that
Mr. Johnson, again,
the Westminster
brevity,
approach that
please.
you've deprecated led to significant benefits for the people of Northern Ireland.
Does it follow from your agreement with that suggestion that you would not countenance binding the devolved administrations to a one-nation approach led by Westminster that flip-flopped, dithered, delayed, exercised indecision and or poor judgment?
I don't think I agreed with your approach, and it does not follow.
Divergence and clarity in messaging is something that you touched on, and my lady, it's my final topic. You blame divergence of the devolved administrations, some getting more blame than others, but you blame that divergence and differentiation of approach for the lack of clarity in messaging. And you know that the devolved administrations and the leaders who have provided statements to my lady don't necessarily agree with you. That the concerns raised by Paul Given, to take one example, is that if there is a need for divergence across the four nations, the communication around it simply needs to be managed. This was something that was not done well at the early stages of the pandemic. The Prime Minister tended to speak as though he was speaking for all four nations rather than giving space to the devolved administrations to manage communications. And my lady has heard a great deal of evidence about England-focused data being cited, about an England or even London-centric approach being adopted by Westminster. To borrow the words of Professor Henderson, if you choose not to be clear in your messaging, Mr. Johnson, do you accept that that's your choice?
I think the issue was that within the UK and accepting the particular issues raised by the island of Ireland, it's a single epidemiological unit. The trouble was that we were from time to time, and we mustn't exaggerate this, from time to time there was a dissonance in the message. I think that when message was so important, it would have been ideally we would have had complete coherence, because I think sometimes people found it hard to follow and couldn't see why one area was different from another.
Was a reason for that confusion, to the extent that there was confusion, because of your government choosing a lack of clarity in message and not respecting the clear and giving a clear understanding of the need for regional differences?
No, I think the reason was the difference in the messaging and people being confused as to what exactly they were being asked to do.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Campbell. Ms Harris. Now, if you look around the pillar, Mr Johnson, Ms Harris is in the back.
Good afternoon, my lady. Good afternoon, Mr Johnson. I appear on behalf of Covid-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru, representing bereaved families in Wales. In the time I have available, I'd like to ask you some questions, again, about relations between the UK government and the Welsh government this time, and including some questions relating to the different approaches during autumn of 2020. I apologise in advance that there is some treading on ground which has already been covered. I will be approaching matters from a, obviously, Welsh government perspective. First of all, with regards to coordination and decision-making between the four nations, and I'd like to ask you a question about the approach to the arrangements for the four nations to communicate with each other and to seek to reach agreement on the way forward. First of all, I'd like to refer to a passage in the report which has been commissioned by the inquiry from, as has been mentioned, Professor Henderson. And this records that at the early stage of the pandemic, there was praise for the way that intergovernmental relations were conducted. And the report cites Mr Vaughan Gething, Health Minister for Wales, on the 10th of March 2020, saying about COBRA the following: "I don't always agree with Matt Hancock, and I certainly don't always agree with Boris Johnson. But during our COBRA calls, there has been a genuinely serious and grown-up attempt to go through issues and to reach agreement on finding the best way forward, the best way through." That's what he said. And the report then goes on to say that by September 2020, enthusiasm had waned, and it was suggested that an absence of four nations meetings had not been helpful when it came to clarity in communications. My second point of context for this question is that we know, of course, as has been mentioned, COBRA did not meet at all between the 10th of May and the 22nd of September 2020. And that, of course, included the period when the UK as a whole was coming out of lockdown. Having gone into lockdown together, it included the time, that period included the time when the UK and, of course, the four nations together were coming out of lockdown. So bearing that in mind, my questions are: do you agree that the type of endeavour that Mr Gething describes in the quote, i.e. genuinely serious and grown-up attempts to go through issues and reach agreement, do you agree that that is what was needed between the four nations during the pandemic? That's the first part. And the second part of the question is, do you agree, and I think you may have indicated your opinion on this already, but I'd like to ask you for any further reflections on the point, do you agree that in order for there to be the best chance for that type of engagement having been sustained throughout the pandemic, that there needed to have been different arrangements after May 2020 to those that were in place at that stage? And I'm not asking about changing the responsibilities of devolved nations. I'm asking about the machinery for interactions, given the framework that we have.
So I think the answer is yes and then no, if I've got your questions in the right order.
Yes, you have got my questions in the right order. Yes, and so and your answer no is to my suggestion that what was needed in order to sustain that kind of serious and grown-up attempt type engagement did not need, as has been suggested, a more predictable pattern of engagement with the Prime Minister for the devolved administrations than existed with the arrangements that were in place.
I don't think it did. I think the UK effort was remarkable, and there was far more that united us than divided us. I have excellent relations and did have excellent relations with Mark Drakeford. I know he always wanted to have more meetings, but I did believe that Michael Gove was doing an excellent job, and I believe that Mr. Drakeford recently told Mr. Gove that actually he thought that the collaboration had been very good.
In Mr. Drakeford's evidence, he has said that there was a vacuum in that there wasn't the possibility of speaking directly to the Prime Minister sufficiently. And he's referred to the need for a regular checkpoints with the Prime Minister. Would you not agree that had there been a greater opportunity for that to happen, then that would have meant that it would have been more possible and more likely that differences could have been ironed out and there could have been a more coherent and coordinated approach forged between the four nations?
I think that every Prime Minister would like to do much more the whole time. I had to do whatever I could to fight COVID. I thought that that the system we had going was pretty good, and I felt that the Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster was doing a good job of interacting with the DAs. If I'd felt that wasn't the case, if I felt that there was a serious breakdown of relations between the centre and the DAs, I would of course have intervened, but that didn't happen.
So to summarise then, Mr. Johnson, you evidently felt that the arrangements that there were in place were sufficient to promote a forging of a coordinated four nations approach. I think that's your indication.
I think that within the limits of what was going to be politically realistic, given the prerogatives of the DAs, I think that that's entirely right.
And you're aware, of course, that that's not a view that is shared across the devolved administrations.
Well, I'm as I said to you just now, I'm not certain that quite how strongly your point is echoed. I think actually I've heard that Mr. Drakeford in particular feels that the level of cooperation was good.
Well, Mr. Johnson, that's not evidence that's been submitted to Module 2 in this inquiry, and that is certainly not consistent with the written evidence that's been submitted on behalf of Mr. Drakeford. I'd like to ask you about the phrase that you used and the point that's made in your witness statement, where you stated it's optically wrong for the UK Prime Minister to hold regular meetings with other devolved administration ministers. This, of course, has been highlighted previously. It is a statement that you made, it's not in a WhatsApp message, or it's not in somebody's diary, not intended to be published. This is in your witness statement. Would you agree that as a Prime Minister in the time of a pandemic public health crisis, that you should have decided on what were the appropriate arrangements for consultation with the devolved administrations solely on the basis of what would be best to further the aim of an effective response to the pandemic, and not your views about optics, that optics should not have formed part of that decision-making?
Well, I think that, that was the reason we did it, because I think that the Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster was well placed to conciliate, to bring people together, and to get on with explaining and coordinating the position.
I understand that that's your view, Mr. Johnson, but with regard to the statement about optics, it can't be right, can it, that optics are a factor when deciding on what's the best setup for engagement with the other devolved governments during a pandemic.
I think
you'd agree with that.
So I think my considerations were primary the risk of, to be absolutely frank with the inquiry, the risk of pointless political friction and grandstanding because of the well-known opposition of some of the DA administrations to the government and also to avoid unnecessary leaks. And I thought that the way to minimise divergence and tensions, actually, and this, you can quarrel with this judgment, but I thought the way to minimise divergence and tensions was to take the temperature down and to have business-like and practical meetings between the CDL and the DAs, and that's what we did. And I think by and large it was extremely effective.
Thank you. I've heard your answer, Mr. Johnson. I'll move on to the next question, and I'd like to ask you now to address, please, how the UK government regarded the Welsh firebreak, which was in place from the 23rd of October to the 9th of November 2020. The first question is, when the UK government was informed by the Welsh government of its plan to enter a firebreak, which is, as we know, a short lockdown, did this trigger any consideration by the UK government of alignment of England with Wales, by which both nations would move forward together to a lockdown at the same time? And that's bearing in mind that the UK government announced a national lockdown for England on the 31st of October, so only a few days later, the duration of which was 4 weeks to the 2nd of December.
Of course I gave, because I can't remember the exact date when I saw to answer your question, the news of the Welsh firebreak when I was informed about it. I'm sure that we would have thought about seeing if we could do things together. We've gone extensively this morning through my thinking around that issue, and that's why we went for the option that we did.
Was there any thinking that it would be better for both nations to be acting in a coordinated way together at that point?
I'm sure that we would have. I don't remember any specific conversations about this, but I'm sure we were thinking the whole time about the choice between fire breaks, lockdowns, and intensifying tiering, and all the other things that we've discussed today, and that might have meant England and Wales acting together, or it might not. But I'm certain that would have been. You're right to make the point that would have been one of the advantages had we chosen to go that way, but we didn't.
Right. Now, one of the points that you've made in your witness statement is that you can understand why Wales decided on a firebreak, as the incidence in Wales was high and tiering was not working well. That's your observation. And you go on to state your view that the Welsh firebreak was not effective. You say it doesn't seem to have made a difference in Wales. So I'd like to ask you, in hindsight, what do you think would have been the right course for Wales? Is it the case that Wales should have had, in fact, a longer lockdown? It was 17 days, and we know, of course, the English lockdown was 4 weeks. Should Wales also simply have had a 4-week-long lockdown, or should it have had its lockdown earlier?
I think it was striking that we ended up really doing pretty much the same sort of thing, and I think that the it was an illustration of how the UK tended to in spite of everything, to move more in step than sometimes the politics seem to suggest.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask you now about clarity in messaging. And one of the points that you made in your evidence yesterday was that clarity and unity of messaging was very important. And I'd like to ask you about the change of message from the UK government's stay at home to stay alert and how that was handled. And by way of context to the question, the change was related to the route out of lockdown. And if I could ask to pull up on the screen, please, the document INQ 000256846. And that's there. That's there. Thank you very much. So what you see there is a record compiled by the Principal Private Secretary of the First Minister for Wales, and it's in an email dated the 8th of the 5th, 2020, and it's a record of a meeting with Mr Gove on the 8th of May of the devolved administration's first ministers, and it precedes the COBRA meeting, which was on the 10th of May, which dealt with the announcement or discussion prior to the announcement of the road out of lockdown. And if I could refer to some passages briefly in this, just to introduce the question that I'd like to ask you, having looked at this document and one other document very briefly. So first of all, we have the text key points from call today with CDL and FM's Scotland and NI. And obviously the Welsh First Minister was present as well. And first bullet point, COBRA expected Sunday afternoon. A little bit further down the page, recognition that different jurisdictions may move at different pace depending on progress of disease and practicalities, for example, different school calendars, but this does not undermine Four Nations' approach. Then a little further down, if we go to the bullet point, the penultimate bullet point, DAs emphasised keeping core stay-at-home message. Gove will reinforce with PM, and then CDL summarised, recognition that different pace of change reflects devolution and pace of disease. He will make sure we have time to contribute to COBRA discussions. And then finally, will talk to PM re-stay at home narrative. So it's obvious, of course, from that document, Mr Johnson, just to confirm that the devolved administrations wanted to stay with the stay at home message at that time. Thank you. And if I could now ask for this next document to be pulled up, please. It's INQ 000216537. And this is a record that has been compiled of the COBRA meeting on the 10th of May. This is the record compiled by the Communications Director for the Welsh Government. And this record, if I can ask to go to the third page of this record, and just very briefly, some of the observations that are recorded that were made. The issue about messaging relating to the change of message from stay at home to stay alert was raised by the First Minister for Scotland, but as we know, it was a matter where there were concerns from all the devolved administrations. And she has raised the point, and at the top of page 3, we see Prime Minister responded that nothing will appear in Scotland that will cut across the stay-at-home messages. And then in the next paragraph, we see that the UK Director of Communications, Alex Aiken, he makes some observations. I think it's fair to say that the summary of what he's saying is that he's summarising the merits of the change to stay alert. He says, stay alert encourages people to change behaviour and permissions. It has polled well. Monday into Tuesday, we will start national advertising to start to change behaviours. And then if we look a little bit further on, it refers to, in the next paragraph, to the First Minister for Scotland, reiterating that they would not be moving to the stay alert message and looking for assurances that there would be no paid ads on TV or elsewhere in Scotland. This would undermine messages of the Scottish Government. Prime Minister said they will deconflict messaging as far as possible. We can move forward as 4 nations. Now is the moment to recalibrate messaging. And then further text relating to what you then went on to say. So the question that I'd like to ask, arising out of looking at those passages, is, as you can recall, what did the UK government do to make sure that the change of message took account of the fact that the devolved administrations were not changing their message? They wanted to stay with stay at home as the main message. And what did the plan to deconflict amount to?
Well, if I may say so, and thank you very much for taking us through all this. I think you're rather eloquently illustrating one of the problems that we had, and you're perfectly correct that there was a divergence in the message and in the advice, and in England certainly we felt that the people had been through an awful lot. There'd been a huge sacrifice effort by the public to get the R down below 1. People needed to know whether they should go back to work or not. We wanted to have a message to allow people to go back to work if they could, and to get things going because of the very serious harms that we had seen. And now the difficulty was, as you rightly say, that in other parts of the UK they had a slightly different approach, and it was hard to get a message that everybody could agree upon.
Yes, and a message wasn't agreed on. That's clear, isn't it? There wasn't agreement about the move to stay alert. The devolved administrations, as you've confirmed, wanted to stay with stay at home. And my question is what did the UK government do? Did it plough ahead with stay alert, regardless, with very little adjustment? Or did it do all that could sensibly be done to make sure that there was, and you've emphasised the need for clarity, that there was as much clarity as possible so that people who lived in each of the 4 nations knew what applied to them? Did the UK government do all it could sensibly do in order to bring about that outcome?
The difficulty was, I think that we tried as much as we could to forge a consensus. I think it would be fair to say that certainly in Scotland and Wales, I'm not certain of Northern Ireland, but certainly in Scotland and Wales, there was throughout the pandemic under the Labour government in Wales and under the SNP in Scotland a general, a greater degree of caution and a greater desire to keep within lockdown measures than there was in the UK government as a whole. And I sympathise with that. I understood why people felt like that, and I think that went very much with the grain of a lot of public opinion. But we also had to try to reflect the fact that we got the R down below 1, and there was no point in doing that unless you were going to try to not just to save life, but also to take advantage of the freedom that gave us. And it was, and this is a perfect example of the difficulty that we had of having public health messaging that was divergent across the UK.
Well, Mr. Johnson,
I think it would have been, frankly,
I'm afraid there's no more time.
It would have been better.
I have to finish.
It would have been better to have a unified approach. Though I appreciate and I can from all the questionings that I've had, the legitimate sensitivities that raises in the DAs. We've got to find a way of doing this that doesn't tread on people's toes, but produces a unified answer.
I mean, the UK government itself needed to be clear, didn't it? You'd agree with that?
And the UK government was clear. The problem was that within the UK, we have, under our devolved settlement, we have the perfect right of people to announce policies that were divergent.
Thank you very much, Ms Harris. I'm afraid everybody's running over and we can't have too long a day today, so could everybody else who's coming afterwards please stick to their time limits. Ms Mitchell. Ms Mitchell's over there, Mr.
Yeah.
Johnson.
Mr Johnson, I am instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. In his evidence to the inquiry, Lord Edward Udney Lister was asked about a chain of emails where the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, was requesting a telephone call with you. And this was on the 5th of March 2020, an important day because it was the day that COVID was added to the list of notifiable diseases. So it was a landmark day. An answer to asking why there was a reluctance to have the First Minister contact you, Lord Edward Udney Lister gave the following evidence, and this is from the transcript of 7th November 2023, page 105. Well, I mean, as you can see from the exchange of emails, the meeting took place, so I certainly wasn't trying to block that meeting taking place, but there was quite a lot of tension between the Prime Minister and the First Minister. They had no real personal relationship of any kind, other than that they, I think, generally didn't like each other very much. I would like to ask, is this a fair characterisation of the relationship between you and the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon?
Oh, I'm sorry to hear Eddie said that. Actually, I had no ill will whatsoever towards the First Minister of Scotland. When I've talked to her, we've got on very well and had a friendly relationship. And as I think you just said, we did indeed have a meeting.
Is it odd that such a close and senior person working for you got that impression?
Well, I think that the let's put it this way: much as I love the SNP, they weren't politically. There was a certain amount of toing and froing between the SNP and me as the Prime Minister. I wouldn't like to produce everything that they've said about me over the years. But
let's just focus on these particular questions. You say you had plenty of opportunity to meet the leaders of the devolved administration, but as my learned friend, one of my learned friends has already pointed out to you, between May and October you hadn't. If it were to be correct that you had a certain degree of reluctance to meet with the First Minister, does that play into the fact that there were so few meetings during this time?
I think we've gone into the reasons for all this quite a lot, and I think I think Nicola was at a Cobra that we had quite shortly thereafter. I remember a conversation, a long discussion involving us, and several discussions involving her at meetings throughout the pandemic, and genuinely, my relations with her have always been friendly and professional. I think the reasons for the approach that we took were, as I've been saying to others, that I thought a grown-up way of doing this that would take the steam out of things, keep things focused on the needs of the UK public, would be to manage it in the way that we did.
And why would, as you say, taking the steam out of things, why would that require Mr Gove to be appointed to the role?
Well, I think, as I say in my statement, I think he was well suited to the job of bringing people together, hearing people's opinions, conciliating, without people who are not necessarily my number one political fans, feeling the need to chip paint off the government.
Mr. Johnson, you say, I don't need this up, but you say at paragraph 191 of your statement that you've given to this inquiry that sometimes when you had to make political decisions about what was going to happen with the country, sometimes decisions were urgent and needed to be made extremely quickly, which could present a challenge. Either we would need to convene a COBRA, invite the DAs to a cabinet meeting or a UK government subcommittee meeting at which their role was not always completely clear, or we would need to take a decision ourselves and bring the DAs on board. None of this was ideal. Now, as we've seen from this inquiry as it's taken place, a lot of government in the modern day appears to be done by way of very fast means of communication: text, email, WhatsApps, phone, video conferencing. Why do you consider that consulting the DAs would have prevented urgent decision making?
I'm sure there could have, in an ideal world, perhaps we could have found a way of doing it. My concern was that the DAs would understandably and use their legitimate prerogatives to do things differently, and from time to time to come out of what were meant to be confidential meetings and understandably want to talk to their own media within the DAs about what was going on and to explain the position. Now, I think the inquiry needs to reflect upon this, and it's not for me to say what the inquiry needs to reflect on, but I've found that it was a difficulty during the conduct of the pandemic. The virus doesn't respect any borders within the UK. The virus doesn't respect administrative boundaries.
With respect,
we saw this problem with the tiering approach. I think that we need to think as far as we possibly can about ways of getting a unified message, and I say that with maximum respect to the DAs and to their.
I'm coming on to the issue of messaging. That will be a chapter I will develop. But at the moment, I would like to stay with the issue of how to interact with the DAs in the times of, for example, a pandemic. You have talked about there needs to be a structure that should be put in place to allow for consultation between the UK government and the devolved administrations during emergency situations. And you have indicated that what you would like is a leak-proof integrated system. Can you help the inquiry as to how that might be done?
Not at present, no, because I think it's very difficult. And it may be that it's a contradiction in terms, but that's the ideal.
It is certainly, I think, been said earlier in the inquiry that government leaks.
It does. But what you don't typically have in government is a mixture of politicians who are, by definition, adversarial to each other in wanting to remove each other from office in the sense they belong to different parties. And
but Mr. Johnson,
that's one of the complexities that the pandemic threw up.
The questions that were being discussed in these meetings weren't about that sort of thing. They were about dates and times and what should be used, whether we should use masks, or there wasn't a necessity or scope for that in those meetings.
I think what happened was that every topic rapidly became political because, of course, different constituencies in different parts of the country had different views about things, and that's the sad reality. I'm not saying this problem is insoluble. I'm just saying that within the time that we had available, it was hard to manage. I thought the best way to manage it, given the urgency, was to try to take the heat out of things, to get CDL to bring people together, to explain and to conciliate, and if necessary, I would come in and talk to people as much as I could.
We've heard that, Mr Johnson. I wonder if I can have inquiry number 000136751 up, please. This is an email from Imran Shafi to Chris Whitty, and it relates to a meeting on the 14th of March. There was a meeting on the 14th of March involving yourself, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, CLD, the CMO, the CSA and other senior officials. There was no DA presence at this meeting, so no one from Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, which discussed the need for a cross-government signed-off package on shielding the vulnerable and elderly. It was noted that the decision on when to implement this package would be based on advice from the CMO and the CSA. The advice was to include how to handle the DAs. And you can see that in respect of the particular document at the very last entry on number 1. What did you understand, or what do you understand by the phrase, how to handle the DAs?
Well, I think that the inquiry will know very well the context of this email within the timetable of COVID. It's coming the very day, in the early afternoon of the very day when we realised that we're behind in the curve, and that we have to take very urgent action.
Indeed, Mr Johnson, I think
what this email reflects is the view of my private secretary Imran, that we've got to get onto the DAs as fast as possible.
Well, what is meant how to handle the DAs? I mean, you say it's his view, but you were there at the meeting, and this meeting concluded with action points, and it's the first action point.
Well, the question would have been who to ring, how to set the ball rolling, how to bring people together.
Earlier on in your evidence yesterday, you were asked about mass gatherings. And I think it would be fair to say that broadly you accepted that it had been the wrong call to allow mass gatherings to go ahead. Is that correct?
Well, I think what I said was that the advice on mass gatherings was that it was paradoxical in the sense that it was counterintuitive, because the scientific advice was that they were banning mass gatherings could be worse because you would drive people into smaller locations, pubs and so on, where the transmission would be even higher. That was the logic.
I think Mr Whitty described it as, in a sense, technically correct, but logically incoherent to the general public.
I think that it was put to me that it was logically coherent in the sense that we wanted to reduce we wanted to do what we could to reduce transmission, and it was put to me that banning mass gatherings itself would not really help because for the reason I've given.
Can I have the document inquiry number 000129230? This is a WhatsApp message with yourself dated 11/3, 2020. As we can see, it reads, I spoke to Chris Whitty at length about your concerns about the comms tomorrow getting overcomplicated. He thinks there's a really simple way of describing what we want people to do in future, based on from Monday, if you're ill, stay home. He's going to make sure that by Cobra, we're in a good position. However, he also thinks the Scots are going soft on mass gatherings, and that Nicola has decided she definitely wants to move on some totemic cancellations. Now, the reason I flag this up is this is being used as a possible reason for Scotland just doing things differently. Would it be fair to say that, in fact, in retrospect, the correct call was to call off those gatherings and to send the correct signal to the public that this was an important thing and everybody had to be very careful about their health?
I can't say how much of a difference it would have made at that stage. What I've tried to tell you is the reasons why we, at a very early stage in our understanding of the pandemic, had gone for one option, and what you've clearly got here is for what we thought were sound epidemiological reasons, and what you've got is Scotland using its prerogatives to do something different. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the epidemiology, you have a divergence of approach.
Indeed, and what I'm asking you is retrospectively.
And the risk is that in the end, you start to undermine public understanding.
Indeed, the inquiry has heard that and understands it. What I am asking you to reflect upon is, retrospectively, was that the right call?
I can't say. I think that what
to
certainly wasn't helpful throughout was to have different messages.
Well, that's exactly the matter I'm coming on to. The issue of differential messaging is one which has peppered your evidence so far. In your statement at page 30, I don't need that brought up, but in your statement at page 30, paragraph 126, it says, looking back, we should have thought much harder about the legal basis for the measures proposed. There's a respectable argument that we should have used civil contingencies legislation rather than public health. By allowing for at least the appearance of divergence in approach between the various parts of the UK, we were risking considerable public confusion and frustration when clarity of message was crucial. Now, given, as you've already identified, the prerogative of devolved administrations, in particular Scotland, where health is a devolved matter in Scotland, where Scotland has access to its own data, its own government, its own CMO, its own DCMO, and it has, I suppose, the best view on what's happening in its own area, i.e. the different spread of COVID perhaps between the Scottish Islands and London. Are your comments fair or proper?
My comments on...
Is your comment that the appearance of divergence in approach between the various parts of the UK we're risking considerable public confusion and frustration?
Well, I think that
clarity?
Obviously that's for the inquiry to decide. But I think I'm really grateful to you for raising all this. But I was worried that there was a continual dissonance of messaging, and I was worried that would do two things. It would confuse people, and that in the end it would undermine people's confidence in the message. One or other of these points had to be
I would
right.
like to,
which one was it?
And I would like to take you to that. First of all, I've got two issues left. First of all, the stay alert message. You say clarity and consistency are important, you are sensitive to this, that the messaging was so important and you were concerned that people found it hard to follow. The fact was, the message was stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives, and it was changed by the UK government by itself to stay alert. Did you have any communications with the devolved administration saying that you were going to change it?
Well, I think the previous council for, I believe it was the Welsh bereaved families, indicated that there had been a consultation about that.
Had there been if I may put this to you, if there was such a meeting and conversations were had, why was consistency of messaging not an issue when the UK government decided to change its advice, but the other three devolved administrations didn't?
I think perhaps I could put it this way: the pandemic changed and the virus changed and its virulence, and we had to change our response. And
I think the difficulty...
I think that the just to complete the point, I think the problem was that we would find sometimes that there was a difference in message. I don't want to make too much heavy weather of this, but I think sometimes it was a problem.
That brings me to my last point, but just before I leave the issue of stay alert, Professor Halpern has given evidence to this inquiry that the phrase that was changed was so bad because it told you to worry and it didn't tell you what to do. He described it as the worst combination, and I would respectfully allow you to reflect upon that. If I can take you on to my final point, and it's in relation to a report, an expert report, which has been heard detail of in this inquiry by Professor Ailsa Henderson, and it's about confusing messages. Now, you have said in your evidence that messaging was incredibly important. Messaging in the end was the most important tool we had to deal with the virus. I don't think we should deprecate the importance of messaging. So at the heart of what you were doing, you thought messaging was a critical tool in relation to the pandemic. If we can have before us inquiry number 000269372, the report by Professor Ailsa Henderson, page 49, paragraphs 151 and 152. This is about advice given by the UK government over communications with the public. If about halfway down the paragraph, it starts an analysis of the text prepared speeches. An analysis of the text prepared speeches throughout 2020 shows that those speaking on behalf of the UK government did an incomplete job of outlining the territorial scope of their data, information or guidance. In the first months, there was almost no mention of devolved administrations or their first ministers. There was little attempt to outline what applied UK-wide and what applied only to England. The phrase "this country" was employed frequently to mean England or Great Britain or the United Kingdom. In general, spokespeople were slightly more likely to clarify if a UK-wide matter applied to the whole of the UK. And it goes on to give an instance. Given by your own admission the critical nature of the communications and the fact that messaging was the most important tool the UK had to deal with the virus, was sufficient consideration given by the UK government to ensuring that the geographical, jurisdictional of their data and information and guidance was made clear?
Well, I did my level best during the press conferences to try to make clear where the restrictions applied to. And I remember several times saying that they applied only in England and trying to restrict what we were saying. But I think,
well, Mr. Johnson, I have one example.
You can't blame ministers for talking about this country, when that's common parlance. And if I may say,
that ministers are talking on behalf of the UK government to all the people that they are getting it. So if they say this country, it has to be made clear which country it refers to. For example,
we're all one country.
For example, on the 23rd of June 2020, you clarified that measures applied to England only, and that's the one occasion it appears that's been highlighted, and then set out rules to follow for the British public. Is what was needed was clarity, and isn't it, in fact, that the problem was that the difficulty was created by the UK government?
No.
Later on in this report, it says that notwithstanding efforts throughout 2020, the UK COVID press briefings repeatedly failed to clarify rules governing school closures, rules for social gathering, funds for local authorities, funds for the coronavirus community support, the renewal task force, dedicated funding for mental health, bike voucher schemes, increased marshals on rail works, the reopening of car showrooms or other retails were all England specific. And they say this is, the report goes on to say this is particularly important as in some instances government spokespeople were calling for individuals to change their behaviour, and as such rules would not have applied throughout the UK. Indeed, it was advice about rules rather than data that suffered from a particular lack of clarity. So, given what is said in this report, Mr Johnston, did the UK government fail to properly implement the most important tool the UK government had to deal with the virus?
I think that if you look at the public understanding of what we were trying to say, it was remarkable how clearly people got the message, considering the extreme complexity of the rules and considering the fact that there was divergence,
Mr. Johnson,
across the DAs.
Given the complexity,
what I think what you've got here is in all this conversation a perfect example of how different messaging can be confusing for ministers, for people across the whole of the UK. The virus thinks whatever the SNP may think, the virus thinks this is all one country.
I'm not asking.
That's the reality.
I'm not asking questions about the SNP. I'm asking questions about you and your minister's messaging during the pandemic. You have said that what it was extremely complex issues, and there may be no doubt that that was so. But wouldn't that be all the more reason that you made absolutely clear every time you stood up and spoke to the 4 nations that you made it absolutely clear what the rules were for each nation in each country?
Well, I could have done that. I think that, and that might indeed be a way forward. I think it may be that you've hit on a solution, which is that in future it should be entirely the job of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to announce the different rules that apply in different places across the UK, rather than having those messages blurred or anticipated. I happen to think that would still be immensely complicated and people wouldn't understand quite why there were differences. All I'm saying is that I think there were legitimate democratic desire of the DAs to have their own approach to public health. I totally get that and I support that. But in the particular context of a brutal, pitiless pandemic, there had to be some way of helping the public with greater unity of messaging. That's all I'm saying.
And the best way to have such, the best way is not to look for unity, but to look for clarity. Would that be correct?
I think that clarity follows unity.
I think that we've gone far enough on that front.
obliged.
This is not going to become a seminar with respect. I shall return at 3:15. Mr. Thomas.
Former Prime Minister Johnson, may I start by saying how much I appreciate your time here today. Let me introduce myself. I'm Leslie Thomas, and I'm representing FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. Now, I want to see what we can agree on. Can we agree that it's important to acknowledge the collective sacrifice and dedication of healthcare workers, especially those from diverse ethnic backgrounds? Can we agree on that?
I certainly think it's crucial to acknowledge the sacrifice of healthcare workers in the UK everywhere.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And we know that they tirelessly put their lives on the line during the pandemic. You remember, don't you, the nationwide applause every Thursday at 8 p.m. Jess, do you remember that?
I do.
Yeah. And indeed, you yourself owe them a debt in relation to when you were hospitalised and ill. We can agree on that.
I certainly do. And they put themselves in the front line of danger. And in many cases, and particularly, sadly, those from ethnic minority backgrounds paid a terrible price.
They did. They paid a terrible price. So it's in this context that FEMHO seeks insights into various aspects and understands the challenges faced by ethnic minority healthcare workers and communities during this unprecedented time. Now, let me start. I've only got a handful of topics. Let me start with my first topic. Mr. Johnson, considering the expert testimony of the Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, that disparate health outcomes based on vulnerabilities were, quote, entirely foreseeable, and the acknowledgement that pandemics exacerbate existing inequalities rather than creating them, I'd like to focus on the period leading up to the first lockdown in March 2020. During those critical days, why didn't your government put any measures in place in anticipation to mitigate the potential harsher effects of the pandemic on vulnerable and minority groups? Can you help me with that, please?
I certainly can. I think that we recognise that a pandemic, as Sir Patrick has said was going to be brutal for the whole country. But I think that one of the things that I'd been told from the beginning was that if you remember in the conversations that we'd had about the downsides of lockdown, is that they were likely to be felt particularly by those from lower income groups, ethnic minority backgrounds, who would typically, and it's a generalisation, be more vulnerable.
Yes.
So at that particular stage, it was one of the reasons why we were so careful about the timeliness of the lockdowns that we've described.
But Mr. Johnson, just help me with this, because I may have missed this. Bearing in mind that these, as you've just said, were anticipated in low-income groups, ethnic minorities, tell me, what were the measures that your government put in place to protect these groups?
So I've described the disparate impacts of MPIs and lockdowns and the way that affected policy. What we didn't at that stage know, and I think that's what Patrick is talking about, but what we didn't at that stage know is the extent to which the virus itself would impact different groups differently.
Well,
and that was only ready to become apparent in the course of the weeks ahead.
Well, you say in the weeks ahead. Very early on, it became apparent. The first 10 doctors who died were from ethnic minority backgrounds. The first 10 doctors were doctors of colour, Mr. Johnson. You knew that, right?
And that is correct. And
sorry, can I just clarify? You knew that.
Well, let me say what I knew. I knew that from the, and I think I'm right in saying that of the victims in the NHS staff, I think I may have got the figure wrong, but I think it's something like 60% in the first year were from ethnic minority backgrounds. Yeah. I may be wrong about that, but it's something of that order. It was falling disproportionately on BAME staff, and we did spot that very early on. I was very worried about it, and I tried to find out why as fast as we could.
Yeah, Mr. Johnson, just so we're clear, I'm not for one moment suggesting that you didn't try to find out why. What my question was aimed at is what you did, what measures, protective measures, did you put in place to protect these vulnerable groups? That was my question. But let me move on, because time is short. Let me move on to topic.
Well, so we put in all sorts. It would be fair to say until we'd established the chain of causation and what was going on, it was difficult to put in specific measures for specific groups. But clearly we needed to do more to protect NHS frontline staff, and they made a huge and tragic sacrifice.
Yeah, well, we can agree on that. Let's move on to my second topic. In your witness statement, you acknowledge that there was a vast underestimation of the risks related to disparities in health outcomes, and you state at paragraph 46. You state this at paragraph 46. Now, considering this acknowledgement, what were the specific factors or considerations that contributed to this underestimation in the context of disparities in health outcomes, particularly those based on ethnicity?
I think that to begin with, we were looking at the data as it started to come in. It was heartbreaking, and we were uncertain as to the cause. And the question, bluntly, was whether there was whether there were medical reasons or whether there were, as it were, occupational reasons for the greater suffering. And I think it took us a while to try to get to the answer. I mean, we tried to get the answer quite quickly, but a great deal of work was done on that subject. The answer, is, as I'm sure you, of course, know, is that it appears that there isn't any medical grounds. What it, I'm afraid, tragically was fantastic NHS staff from ethnic minority backgrounds in the front line dealing with patients and being exposed to the virus.
Well, it was more. Sorry, forgive me, Mr.
That's
Johnson.
what it seems to me to have been.
Well, forgive me, Mr. Johnson. It's more than that. We had your former Health Secretary, Mr. Hancock, sitting where you were sitting, I believe last Friday, and he agreed with me, and I'm sure you will agree with me, that we can also agree that part of the disproportionate impact on the Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, including healthcare workers, was as a result of institutional racism within the NHS and within the system. Can we agree on that?
I'm not certain. I'm afraid to say that I've seen evidence to support that.
Well,
I'd be.
You are unaware of the report done by Public Health England into the NHS that Mr. Hancock was telling us about, where it was talking about institutional racism. You're completely unaware of that as Prime Minister?
I haven't. I've got to confess to you, seen that report. The information that I had was that wasn't the information that I had did not mention that as a factor.
All right, let me move on. Mr. Johnson, the June 2020 Public Health England report has been cited as a pivotal moment in the understanding and addressing the disparities in risks and outcomes relating to the COVID pandemic. Would you consider this report to be your first substantive opportunity for engagement on this crucial issue?
So on which issue?
I'll repeat the question. On the issue of addressing disparities and risks and outcomes related to the COVID-19 virus.
Right. Well, what we did was to try to make sure that everybody had the best possible protection and to do whatever we could to stop infection of those particularly Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups who were in the front line of the fight against COVID. And,
right. So,
and,
Mr. Johnson,
and sometimes, tragically, we didn't have PPE that was good enough, but we made a huge effort to equip our country with what was necessary.
Sometimes you didn't have PPE. There was an issue at times, was there not, in relation to PPE not being culturally appropriate? You know, people with beards, religious outfits, things like that. Were you aware of that?
That wasn't escalated to me. I was concerned that everybody should have the best possible protection.
Let me move on. Can you share with us your reflections on how the findings of this report influence subsequent actions and policies aimed at mitigating these disparities?
I think that what we wanted to do was to make sure that the incredible frontline staff of the NHS had greater protection, above all by being less overworked. And one of the things that the pandemic was a terrible time, but one of the things that we did was not only to embark on a program of big program of hospital building, but recruiting 50,000 more nurses. And I think we're well on the way to, or the subsequent government is well on the way to achieving that now. And if you're a nurse or a frontline worker, then clearly one of the best ways to mitigate the risk that you face and the disproportionate risk that you face as a Black, Asian, and minority ethnic frontline care worker is having an extra pair of hands to help you. And that was one of the key objectives of the program. And it's a very large program. There are plenty of other things that the NHS now has, I believe, or certainly did when I was Prime Minister, more people in it than it's ever had in
Mr. Johnson,
forgive me.
Thank you.
They have limited time, Mr Johnson.
So I'm not trying to talk
I'm
you
sure
out.
you're not trying to talk me down the clock.
I wouldn't dream of
You
that.
wouldn't dream of that, would you, Mr Johnson?
I wouldn't.
No. Right, I've two more topics and I've finished. Given the first indications of starkly disproportionate rates of infection and mortality in ethnic minority communities, which began to emerge in late March, early April, can we agree on this? Can we agree that there were earlier opportunities for more substantial engagement? Can we agree on that?
I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, let me be blunt. Your government could have done a lot more, a lot earlier.
Well, we did whatever we could to get all our staff the equipment that we.
It wasn't enough, Mr. Johnson, was it?
Well, we worked incredibly hard and fast to get people the equipment we needed. That doesn't mean that I'm not conscious of the immense effort.
People we were clapping for. Do you remember?
I do, and I'm not. I am deeply conscious of the sacrifice that they made.
Last topic, and then I sit down and I'll shut up. At paragraph 656 of your witness statement, you say, quote, "I was not provided with and did not consider any equality impact assessments when making decisions about imposing, easing, or making exceptions to NPIs. But that's not to say I did not receive and consider many documents containing details of the effects of lockdown across society or equalities and distributional impacts," end of quote. Question. In the absence of such assessments, and that's the equality impact assessments, can you shed light on the sources of intelligence or information that informed your understanding of the disproportionate impact of MPIs on ethnic minority groups? What were the sources of your intelligence and information?
Well, there was data that I saw. I can't tell you exactly the provenance, but there was data that suggested that I think when you come to lockdowns, people from the Bangladeshi community were 4 times more likely to be engaged in closed sectors. People from the Pakistani community were, I think, twice as likely to be engaged in closed sectors. From my own extensive work as chairman of Transport for London and all the work I did as mayor had taught me the massive disproportionate impact measures such as closures of retail, hospitality, and so on were likely to have on those very groups. So I didn't need.
You didn't need the intelligence.
I knew.
You knew.
Okay. I was getting data, but I also knew that these measures were likely to be disproportionate in their.
Thank you, Mr. John. Milady, I concede another 30 seconds under my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Thomas. Mr Metzer.
Thank you, my
Mr.
lady.
Johnson.
Mr Johnson, I ask a small number of questions on behalf of the long COVID groups. Matt Hancock and Dominic Cummings have said they were advised in early 2020 about the possibility of longer-term sequelae of COVID-19 by both Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty. On the 17th of May 2020, you shared an article, we didn't go to it, about people reporting prolonged symptoms of COVID-19 in a WhatsApp group with them all. In short, did you also receive advice about long-term sequelae from Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty at that time?
Not as far as I can remember at that time. I do remember repeatedly asking for advice, and I think that I finally got a paper from memory in summer of 2021.
Yes, we'll come to that. You were never provided with scientific advice doubting the existence of long COVID, yet you've said that you were only persuaded that long COVID existed in June 2021. You've referred to that.
I didn't say that. I was only given scientific advice.
Yes.
On COVID in June 2021.
Yes, I'm asking you questions about when you were persuaded. You were only convinced by him, that's Chris Whitty, that long COVID was a serious problem when, from July 2020, you had been receiving letters from patient advocates and members of Parliament asking for formal recognition of long COVID. In September 2020, Mr. Hancock reminded you about long COVID. In October 2020, the NHSE announced a 5-point plan for long COVID. And on the 13th of October 2020, Sir Patrick Vallance advised you about considering long COVID at a cabinet meeting. And he said, in evidence here, that he described long COVID to you and you were sceptical about it.
When was this?
13th of October 2020, Sir Patrick Vallance was. So I've given you a sequence of from July to October. Why wasn't this overwhelming body of advice and correspondence in 2020 sufficient to persuade you that long COVID was a serious problem at that time?
I don't want you to think, so first of all, I don't want anybody to think that I didn't think that it could be a serious problem. What I wanted to know was the evidence. I wanted to understand what exactly the sequelae consisted in, and how I should explain it to people, what the symptoms exactly were, and what kind of a syndrome it really was. And I was having some difficulty getting a clear picture, and that was the reality.
So this is a question, it appears, in relation to formal advice, written advice. But the box grid of October 2020, and we needn't go to it, 251910, that you scored bollocks on, was referring to the first NIHR report into long COVID, a research paper that had already been published on long COVID by that time. It laid out symptomatology on long COVID. If you wanted advice, why didn't you simply ask for that report to be provided to you?
I did ask for the evidence, and I did ask for reports to be provided, and eventually one was provided. I think that I think there's a slight conceptual. First of all, I wish to again to recognise the hurt that those words must have caused to people suffering from long COVID, and the very real suffering that they endure. And but when I referred to Gulf War syndrome, I was making I think a reasonable question, and I'm sure you wouldn't say that everybody suffering from Gulf War syndrome is mistaken.
Mr. Johnson, I don't want to be developed about Gulf War syndrome. I just want to ask you, do you agree you never asked for the NIHR report to be provided to you?
I certainly asked for a report to be provided for me into long COVID, and it was eventually provided, but much later on.
Yes, so not that report. Do you agree?
Yes.
Thank you. In July 2021, the Cabinet Office planned a policy which accepted high prevalence of COVID-19. It noted that the strategy was to continue to live with COVID without restrictions. One risk was noted as high rates of long COVID. The autumn-winter plan of 2021-22, published in September 2021, emphasised building defences through pharmaceutical interventions, and for long COVID only acknowledged the need for treatment. There was no effective treatment for long COVID, as there were no pharmaceutical interventions to prevent its development, and you agree the best way to prevent long COVID is to prevent infection of COVID-19. Did the government choose to adopt a policy which you knew would result in a significant number of people, including young people, suffering from long COVID?
What we did was to try to fight COVID, to try to fight infection and mortality in people of all ages by stopping the spread of the disease. And I thought that by fighting COVID, a fortiori, you could fight long COVID.
Yes, but you understand that in relation to the decisions in relation to COVID and long COVID, they have different symptomatology.
And that was precisely what I wanted to understand, and that was why I requested the report and the advice that I did. And when I spoke about Gulf War syndrome, what I meant literally was, can somebody explain to me, because Gulf War syndrome, as I'm sure nobody would say, I'm sure you wouldn't, that everybody suffering from Gulf War syndrome is mistaken.
Yes, Mr. Johnson, I want to move away from Gulf War syndrome with greatest respect. A choice was taken to allow high rates of transmission, which brought more cases of long COVID, and you've said a number of times that messaging was incredibly important. Messaging in the end was the most important tool we had to deal with the virus. Why didn't you therefore communicate the risk of long COVID to the public so they could take measures to protect themselves?
Well, the way to protect yourself against long COVID is to avoid getting COVID.
That's not the simple. It doesn't follow, does it? They're not. There are other specific features to long COVID.
Unless I'm much mistaken, I don't believe there's a way of contracting long COVID without getting COVID.
But it has a different risk profile. Do you appreciate that?
Well, forgive me, and I don't wish in any way to, to minimise the importance of what you're saying, but I thought that the best way to fight the possibility of people having long-term sequelae from COVID was to stop them getting COVID in the first place.
Yes. Do you accept there's an indiscriminate risk to all people, children and the young, which has a different risk profile specific to long COVID?
Well, that was one of the things I was very interested to understand. I think that may very well be the case, but it is still also true, logically, that the best way to stop those individuals contracting COVID is to stop the spread of the disease, full stop.
Yeah. So can I take from that people do need to know about long COVID specifically? They can suffer from prolonged symptoms of COVID-19 and that nothing specifically was done about the risk of long COVID. Do you accept that?
Well, I don't accept that nothing was done about the risk of long COVID because the government did everything that we could to stop the spread of COVID.
Yes. Last question. Last topic. Yesterday, you said in your view, some people thought they may be suffering from long COVID, but there was in fact another cause. The NIHR report, summarised in the October 2020 box return, addressed those very concerns that, in quotes, the lack of recognition of the pattern of symptoms by the public and by healthcare services meant people frequently felt their experiences were not believed, and this left many of feeling isolated and alone in coping with their disease.
And that's the same with Gulf War syndrome, by the way.
Yes, I haven't asked the question yet. It concluded, did the report, that more recognition and more support was needed. Having come to accept, as you have now, that long COVID is a debilitating and disabling illness, causing almost 2 million adults and children to suffer, do you now recognise that your prolonged disbelief in long COVID contributed to the delay in recognising long COVID, led to unwell people not being believed, and has meant decisions were taken on releasing NPIs without consideration of long COVID?
No, I don't think that. I think that if you look at what actually happened from a very early stage, we start investing in research into long COVID, and I think 50 million followed by another 75 million, and into trying to establish the exact pathology of the illness.
But the decisions were taken on releasing NPIs without consideration of long COVID. Do you accept that?
No, I think that there were going to be risks involved in releasing the NPIs. They were going to be basically the risk that the disease would spread. And that was the thing we wanted to fight.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Metzer.
Can I just complete the question, please, my lady? It's the last question, I promise you. Do you accept that widespread transmission of the disease without public communications on the risk of long COVID and without other mitigation measures meant people could not take steps to protect themselves from long COVID? Do you accept that?
No, I think that people were given plenty of advice to protect themselves from COVID, and as soon as we began to understand what long COVID was and its risks, we also publicised the risks of long COVID as well.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Metzer. Mr. Menon, you've moved. Trying to confuse me.
Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon, Mr. Johnson. I ask questions on behalf of a number of children's rights organisations. Can I start by seeing if we can agree on two matters, which I hope are uncontroversial? Firstly, in March 2020, when schools were closed for most children, you believed that schools should only close as a last resort if necessary to save lives and protect the NHS. Is that right?
I certainly believe that the closure of schools was a very, very damaging thing for kids, particularly, as I said earlier on, for kids on lower incomes.
And secondly, the reason that you believed that schools, I suggest, should only close as a last resort was that you recognized at that time, when we went into lockdown in March 2020, that school closures would have a devastating, lasting, harmful impact on many children, particularly vulnerable children, in terms of their development, their socialization, their educational attainment, their life chances, their physical health, and their psychological well-being. Is that fair?
We did recognise that.
Now, given those answers, can we also agree that the primary problem in March 2020 was not the fact that schools were closed for most children to save lives and protect the NHS? The problem was that prior to schools being closed, there was no proper plan, there was no clearly established framework, there was no guidance for schools on remote education, and no arrangements for delivering face-to-face education to vulnerable children under the new social distancing restrictions. That was the problem, wasn't it, in March 2020?
I think that the difficulties we had in delivering education remotely and the other things that you've mentioned certainly compounded the problem. But the basic problem, the prior problem, was that that kids were deprived of the vital education that they needed at a critical time in their development. They were deprived of the society of other kids. They were unable to socialise. It was a terrible, terrible time, and the evidence is, as I'm sure you know, that this was felt most keenly by those on lower incomes, and they basically received about 30% less education than kids from wealthier backgrounds.
So we agree on impact. Can we also agree there was no proper plan?
I think it would be fair to say, from everything that the inquiry has heard so far, certainly from me, that this was a once-in-a-century event, and we were not prepared suddenly to be forced to close schools for the length of time that we did. I think that's fair.
Thank you. In your witness statement, Mr. Johnson, I don't ask for it to be put on the screen. The reference is page 107, paragraph 397. You say that the reopening of schools was one of your key priorities in the summer of 2020, when the first lockdown was easing, putting it ahead, in your words, of the need to lift social and economic measures. Why then, this is the question, why then were hospitality and cultural venues, including pubs, bars, cafes, restaurants, hairdressers, and beauty salons, allowed to reopen on the 4th of July 2020, dubbed Independence Day by some in government, but not schools?
I think that I gave the answer earlier in a previous discussion. The reason was that two things, but I think we thought we would go through till the resumption of the normal school term. But secondly, schools are big potential reservoirs of risk, and the younger people can easily transmit the virus to older and more vulnerable people.
You think schools are larger reservoirs of risk than pubs and restaurants and hairdressers and beauty salons? And non-essential retail, for that matter?
I think that we were thinking about how to do things, how to sequence things, and I'd have to go back and look at some of the discussions, but I think that we thought it's sensible, given where we were in the school calendar, to resume with the normal return of school.
But the reality is that, contrary to what you'd indicated earlier, schools were not the last to close and the first to reopen, were they? Because priority was given in your budget of risk to, amongst other things, pubs and hairdressers. That's the reality, isn't it?
Well, as I say, we faced an unlocking which went on until July. The school holidays normally began then. There were reasons for thinking that it might be sensible to resume school when school normally resumes.
Rather than, for example, as an alternative, keep schools open into August because schools have been closed for so long beforehand.
I think we did look at that. I'm not sure that it was practically very easy to do.
Moving then, Mr. Johnson, from school closures to the social distancing restrictions, why did your government largely ignore calls from the Children's Commissioner for England, Anne Longfield, and numerous children's rights organisations to exempt children in England from the social distancing restrictions that became law on the 1st of June and the 14th of September?
Why did we ignore calls to exempt them from social distancing?
Yes.
I would have to look back at the discussions and forgive me, but I think it would. My instinct is it would have been because we wanted to minimise the risk of transmission.
Well, let me just remind you of what the position was. 1st of June, outdoor gatherings of up to 6 people from more than one household became law. 4th of July, so-called Independence Day, all outdoor restrictions lifted, except in Leicester. 14th of September, when numbers began to rise again, the so-called Rule of 6 reintroduced at that stage. And so the position was that in England, children weren't exempted, but in Scotland and Wales, younger children were exempted from the social distancing restrictions, as I'm sure you're aware. Yes?
And I think, well, that takes us back to the conversations we were having just now with the Council for the DAs, and I think in an ideal world we would be able to proceed as one epidemiological unit with one set of messages. Look, I hated all the restrictions that we had to place on schools, and I wanted to get them open. But we faced a really, really awful pandemic, and the judgment was that, this was one of the areas where the scientific emphasis changed, because it wasn't quite as clear back in March. But the judgment was, I remember, later on in 2020, that schools really did present a considerable addition to the budget of risk.
Mr. Johnson, I moved on from schools to the social distancing restrictions.
I thought you were talking about social distancing restrictions within schools.
Not within schools.
Oh, forgive me.
Generally, okay?
Sorry.
And so just to be clear about this, just to remind you, the position was that in England, children under the age of 12, in other words, children who can't go out from their homes independently, were not exempt from the restrictions. They were not given, to use the government's language, that freedom and independence that children in Scotland and Wales were. And so I'm asking, why did England pursue a more draconian approach than Scotland and Wales as far as younger children is concerned?
Well, I think I refer you to what I said just a moment ago. I think that we were trying to reduce transmission, trying to reduce risk, but clearly there was a divergence between the various parts of the UK. I'm not certain in future whether we would want to do it that way.
And just to be fair to you on this, so you know, the inquiry's not heard any scientific or medical evidence from either the CMO or the GCSA to the effect that what Scotland and Wales was doing was somehow dangerous and that the English approach was better, just so you understand the position. Now, opposition to the decision not to exempt younger children from the social distancing restrictions was not confined to the Children's Commissioner and children's rights organizations. Members of your own government and political party were expressing concerns about this. And I'd like to show you one particular WhatsApp exchange, if I may. The reference is 176785, page 24. And if you could indicate when you have that on your screen, it would be appreciated. I think you have it now. And if we could turn to the 11th of October, please, the entry at 15:46:59. This is a WhatsApp exchange between Matt Hancock and Helen Whately, who, as you know, was Minister of State in the DHSC at the time. And Helen Whately says this: "Wish we could loosen on children under 12 on rule of 6 for tier 1. And then sometime about an hour later, she says it would make such a difference for families, and there isn't a robust rationale for it. Now is a really good chance to show we have listened. Lots of MPs were pushing on this during last week's debates." And Matt Hancock replies, "They don't want to go there on this." She asks, "Are we they?" And then this from Matt Hancock, as in number 10, also on curfew, they don't want to shift an inch. In respect of that, first question, were you aware at this time this is
October?
Yeah, mid-October. So this is about a month after Scotland and Wales have exempted children from the rule of 6. Were you aware at that time that Helen Whately and lots of MPs, to use her words, were calling for children to be exempt from the rule of 6? Were you aware of it at the time?
I just want to say how grateful I am to you for bringing this to my attention, because I hadn't clocked this. But it's a great example of the kind of thinking and the kind of debate that was going on at a time when, as everybody knows, and we've been discussing this extensively this morning, the R was going up, and we were about to announce the tiered system. So the 11th of October, we're literally days away from having to ask the country to go back into parts of the country to go back into lockdown, and we are. So the last thing to explain why it might have been difficult for us to signal any kind of relaxation at that stage, to suddenly say that we were going to relax the rules on social distancing for kids, for young people, would have been a very, very peculiar signal to send out at the very moment when we were desperately trying to get the existing measures to work, and we were on the point of toughening them up. And so I think that probably answers your question.
So I think what you're saying is that Matt Hancock was right when he said to Helen Whately in this WhatsApp exchange that number 10 doesn't want to shift an inch. That he's right about that, isn't it?
I don't remember. To be frank, I don't remember a conversation about it, but I can see why we would have been reluctant at that stage, given what was going on in the pandemic.
Finally, Mr. Johnson, I hope again this is uncontentious, taking a global view of the position. Although children had fewer health risks from COVID than adults, particularly older and more vulnerable adults, do you agree that children suffered disproportionately from the government's non-pharmaceutical interventions to contain the virus, both in the short and the long term? Taking an overall view of the pandemic.
I absolutely do, and that's why we put a lot of money into CAMS, into children and adult mental health services. That's why the government decided to have a big catch-up program, a big tutoring program, not as big perhaps as I would have loved to see, but I do think it was an important thing to do. And the short answer is yes, I do think that the educational detriment was a huge, huge consideration. The loss of life chances for young people has to be put in the scales when you're making these appalling choices, as you say, about MPIs, and kids were very much in our minds. But the priority was to save life.
Mr. Johnson, much as I'd like to challenge you on the nature of the government response, the inquiry has understandably decided that that is a matter to be properly explored in 2025 in a separate module. So I don't accept what you've just said, in particular in relation to the catch-up program, but I'm going to have to deal with that on another occasion. Do you understand?
Well, I think I've conceded that it wasn't I wanted a totally massive one. It was pretty big, but I think that it was a big priority of mine.
I understand your answer.
You've put your marker down, Mr. Mennell.
I have.
I'm sure you will come back to it, Sam.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mennell. Mr. Friedman.
Mr. Johnson, I act for 4 national disabled people's organisations. They too want to ask you about your repeated comments in meetings and on WhatsApp messages about older people. For example, that they're going to die anyway, have had a good innings, and should accept their fate rather than destroying the economy. Now, please leave aside for a moment what was done by your government and what you say you truly care about, and no doubt the Chair will look at all that evidence. Our first question, in your choice of words to your government and advisers, were you not being shamefully ageist against those in later life and normalising their premature death?
Thank you very much. No, I was doing my best to reflect what was, I'm afraid, a debate that was very live, and live, I may say, with a great number of older people who would make these points to me. And I wanted to get the answers, and we've discussed earlier on today the downsides of the segmentation approach. That wasn't really going to be enough, but people found that very counterintuitive. They didn't understand why segmentation wouldn't be enough, and you really had to explain it to them.
Mr. Freeman, can I just put a marker down? I did not give permission for you to ask the question shamefully ageist, just so that people understand. Could we please avoid language which I haven't approved, which could be considered emotive?
Absolutely, my lady.
Thank
you. Yes, I accept, and I apologise. It wasn't my lady's choice of words.
It's what I call a forensic flourish, Mr. Freeman. Thank you.
So be it, my lady, but let me nevertheless reflect on your answer just now and your answer to Mr. Keith this morning about these various comments that I know you feel very sensitive about. I just want to paraphrase what we understood to be your answer. As the layperson in the room, I, as the Prime Minister, who had to take the ultimate decision, was voicing these ideas about older people to deal with counter-arguments out there in the public domain that only the elderly should be shielded.
No, not only the elderly. Sorry, forgive me.
Yes.
No, so from the beginning, we had a massive programme of shielding for the vulnerable, as you know, and went
yes.
from about 1.3, 1.5 to ultimately about 2.5 million people, some of whom were shielding for an incredibly long time, and it was a miserable, lonely business. Given all the detriments that people endured, the inability to get the medical health care that they might need, all the downsides of that, it was, I think, reasonable to think about other approaches and whether the continued lockdowns were effective.
Yes, of course, Mr. Johnson.
But in the end, we had no alternative. And,
of course, Mr. Johnson, but forgive me for interrupting you, but I could take you to these comments, however one puts them emotively or otherwise. Once we get into August and September, and these comments mostly made in October, you've had those discussions about how a more dedicated form of segregation for the elderly in their households is not going to work, essentially because the virus will break out of the shielding system. And you're taken to the WhatsApp messages by Mr. Keefe. So how does your answer to counsel to the inquiry this morning and to me just now about you putting arguments for only older people being segregated in some form of super shielding therefore have anything to do with your repeated assertions that old people are going to die anyway, that they've had a good innings and we should not sacrifice the economy because of them?
So what I'm trying to put to the scientific opinion is the I want to understand first of all who the potential victims of COVID are at that particular moment, and as everybody knows, it's people of all ages, and I've seen it for myself, because I've seen some figures. I think for the average or the median age of COVID victims, I'm trying to understand what alternatives we have, and I'm reflecting a widespread view that there must be some twin-track strategy. There must be some way in which we can somehow avoid this damage to the entire economy and society, whilst looking after the interests of the elderly. And what I'm trying to get from the scientists is, and from everybody in the room is, well, what is the answer to this? And the answer is, as everybody knows, that there is no alternative approach. There is no way of sequestering the elderly population or the vulnerable sufficiently, and they will die tragically in great numbers when the R gets uncontrollable.
Well, let me then ask you about your knowledge and your words around the broader population of disabled people that were dying. Did you know then, as of autumn of 2020, that COVID posed risk to a wide range of disabled people of all ages, and in that I include people with learning disability, people with Down syndrome, and the like?
Yes, we certainly knew that people with a huge variety of syndromes were particularly vulnerable, and that's why we had a shielding scheme.
Well, that being the case, we do not find you repeatedly raising at this juncture with your government and your senior advisors in WhatsApps and notes and meetings about that problem, in a sense leading from the front with words and actions to let your government know in no uncertain terms that disabled people's lives are worth living. Why is that?
But actually, that's not true. That what we did was to try to stop the spread of the virus and to protect those who were shielding and vulnerable from a breakout.
Well, lastly, and standing back, my lady, if I may, and it does follow from what's been said. Public know, you know, that sometimes you use language, florid language, and one way to conclude about your use of language is that's just Boris Johnson being Boris Johnson. It's a matter for my lady, but is that the kind of conclusion you would want her to reach? Or would you rather her reach a conclusion that language of that florid kind of nature, even if said in jest, should not be used by a government official, and especially one who had the power that you enjoyed in autumn 2020?
Sorry, which language, Mr. Freeman?
Well, the kind of language, whether I describe it emotively or not, that old people have had a good innings.
Oh, I see what you mean.
That they're going to die anyway.
Well, let me thank you.
It's that. I think you understand the question I put to you.
I do understand.
You've probably heard it before.
No, I do understand that, and so let me give you a straight answer on that. I think first of all, I regret all hurt and offence caused by publication of language that was not intended for publication, whether it's been recorded by someone's notes or diaries or whatever. These were private conversations with officials. Secondly, a lot of what has been reported is incorrect, and there are words that are ascribed to me that I simply don't recognise. But the third thing is, insofar as it's obviously true that I was from time to time speaking bluntly and in an unpolished way about these issues, it was for two reasons. First of all, I wanted to as I say, to represent the layman, to get an answer that was intelligible. Number two, I wanted everybody in the room to feel that they could also speak freely, because I think when you're sitting in a room full of conversations conducted in learned or bureaucratic language about these complex phenomena, you do need people to feel that they have the space, without being embarrassed, to say things simply, even if taken out of context, they can be made to look unfeeling or uncaring, when people really aren't being unfeeling or uncaring. They're trying to express ideas as simply and as concisely as they can.
Thank you, Mr. Freedman.
Thank you, my lady.
Ms. Davis is over that way. Mr. Johnson.
Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can.
Johnson,
yes,
thank you. I ask questions on behalf of Southall Black Sisters and Solace Women's Aid, who, as you will know, are part of the violence against women and girls sector.
Yes.
And so my two topics are on domestic abuse,
Yes.
which is something that you told us yesterday you were personally very alive to that issue.
Yes.
And you will know that the regulations, the stay-at-home regulations, contained a number of exemptions. One of them was that you could leave because of risk of injury. And we've heard from Mr. Hancock, and it's obvious that that was intended to include risk of domestic abuse besides anything else. Yes. I want to ask you about messaging. My first topic is on messaging, which you've told us is not just an important part of an MPI, but actually an important MPI in itself. And the messages are your addresses to the nation when you announce lockdown. And there were 5 in total. The 23rd of March, the first lockdown, the 31st of October, when you say there's going to be the second lockdown, the 5th of November, when the details of the second lockdown are announced, the 19th of December, which is Tier 4, and then the 4th of January 2021, when you announce the third lockdown. And in all those addresses, you emphasise quite rightly that people must stay at home throughout. And you also refer to some of the exemptions. So on the 23rd of March, you say people will only be allowed to leave their home for the following very limited purposes. And those 4 purposes are shopping, exercise, medical need, travelling to and from work if that's absolutely necessary. And you conclude that part by saying that's all. These are the only reasons you should leave your home. On the other occasions, 31st of October, 5th of November and the 19th of December, you give similar lists. On the 31st of October, you do include the words escaping risk of injury or harm. But on none of those addresses throughout 2020 do you say that people can leave if they're at risk of domestic abuse. You do say that on the 4th of January 2021. You say that explicitly, where you say, or to escape domestic abuse. So why was domestic abuse not mentioned earlier than January 2021?
Thank you. I think that you're making a very good point, and I think in retrospect, we should have given consideration to mentioning that issue explicitly earlier. That didn't mean we were silent or inattentive to the problem. We put money into helplines almost immediately. I think in April we set up the Ask for Annie scheme. I think we as you know, there was a so people could go. So people, under the rules, people could go out to the chemist, for instance.
Well, I'm going to stop because I will probably come on to that, and I'm interested in messaging for the moment. Would you say that the failure to mention it, which you've just acknowledged in hindsight, was an error, is compounded by that phrase of the 23rd of March, saying that's all, these are the only reasons you should leave your home?
Well, I think that I hope that people would have understood that to report a criminal offence was also a reason to leave your home. But clearly, it was something we should have made explicit.
Mm. And in her evidence to the inquiry, Dame Priti Patel, your Home Secretary at the time, said that she and her department had raised the need with Downing Street to refer to domestic abuse amongst the exemptions. So why did you or your team not respond to those representations sooner than January 2021?
I don't remember her raising that with me.
My second topic is about the hidden harms, which is, I think, what you were referring to a moment ago when I stopped you. And you say at paragraph 542 of your statement, we'd learnt many lessons from the first lockdown. We considered such things as the hidden harms, like increased domestic abuse and child abuse, and we wanted to ensure it was essential that services supporting women and children remained available and steps were taken to tackle these crimes. So that's post-first lockdown, learning lessons, and of course there was a Hidden Harms Summit in May 2020 as we're beginning to come out of the first lockdown. In fact, during the second and third lockdown, the same thing happened with domestic abuse as it happened with the first lockdown. Rates of domestic abuse increased during lockdown. So what lessons were learned and implemented for the second and third lockdown in order to protect women and girls from domestic abuse?
Well, in addition to the investment in the helplines, which I think, as I say, began almost immediately in the Ask for Annie scheme, where a victim of domestic abuse could go to the chemist and say that she...
That was in February 2021.
Say that she had a problem. In, I think, March 2020 and April 2020, the domestic violence bill is going through the Commons.
That's got nothing to do with lockdown.
And well, it was actually, I think, a useful tool against DV, giving new statutory powers against coercive behaviour, one kind or another, and other measures. We put money into independent from, I think, right from the beginning of the government. We put more money into independent sexual violence advisors and independent domestic violence advisors, and across Whitehall, so people you could ring up, or people who would help you address the appalling issues that you face. But what we also did across Whitehall was to try to solve what, in my view, is still a chronic problem, which is the inability of the criminal justice system to deal with crimes of rape, domestic violence, sexual violence of all kinds, and to get enough prosecutions. Right. So the government as a whole was working a great deal on this issue, and specifically trying to address the needs of women in lockdown.
The domestic abuse bill received royal assent in April 2021 and
Correct.
started to come into force in July 2021.
Correct.
So that doesn't help us with the...
But you asked me what we were doing. And
in respect to the second and third lockdowns.
Well,
Did you not hear that part? I apologise.
Well, as I said, we put money into helplines almost immediately, and did our best to encourage people to come forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Davis. Mr Jacobs, are you hiding? Where is he?
At the back this time.
Oh, he's usually over there. So, yes, Mr Jacobs.
Mr Johnson, I ask questions on behalf of the Trades Union Congress, okay? My first topic for you is on the approach that you engendered in your government as to consultation with key partners such as unions. And I'm going to ask you about a meeting in July 2021. You will recall, I'm sure, that at that time there was discussion about return to workplaces and the unions that I act for were calling for various measures to advance workplace safety. If we have on screen 273901 and page 478, we will see a note from Sir Patrick of a meeting on the 2nd of July 2021. And towards the middle of that entry, you'll see some quotations attributed to you, Mr. Johnson. Are we going to encourage people to wear masks? Are we going to continue this bollocks, he says, wants everyone back at work. Quote, we can't have the bollocks of consulting with employees and trade unions. They need to all come back to work. All the malingering work-shy people, says how much of civil service is back. Mr. Johnson, was it wrong for you as the Prime Minister to set such a dismissive approach towards consultation with unions?
I don't believe that we would ignore the interests of working people at any stage. And I think that the difficulty that we faced was the colossal damage to the interests of people on, particularly on people on lower incomes, of continuing with lockdowns. And
Mr. Johnson,
and I was very keen to get people back if we possibly could.
I understand you're keen for people
and
to work.
If you look at
I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson. I'm going to put my question again. I'm asking you specifically about the approach you engendered in your government towards consultation with unions. A Prime Minister who says we can't have the bollocks of consulting with employees and trade unions is setting a dismissive approach. Surely you agree with that, Mr. Johnson?
Well, I not necessarily. I think what I didn't want to see was this is July 2021. We've vaccinated a huge proportion of the population. I think by July, well over 50%, faster than any other European country. I'm determined to get people back to work if I possibly can. I think that by the superhuman exertions of the vaccine rollout program, we've put ourselves in a very good position to stage a strong bounce back from COVID. It is vital that we take advantage of the sacrifices that we've made, both in lockdowns and in rolling out the vaccines. I want to
Mr. Johnson,
see people
do any
back
of
in
those
work.
do any of those matters sensibly mean that you don't consult openly with key partners such as trade unions?
Well, I don't. I'm nothing against consultation. What I didn't want to see was a drag anchor put on people getting back into the workplace after the colossal changes that we've been able to make in the epidemic, in the pandemic. The vaccination program had radically changed our relation to the virus, and my worry was, to be absolutely frank with you, that people were going to be slow to acknowledge that, and that there was going to be an inertia and a desire to stay with the working from home pattern, which was not, in my view, necessarily going to be beneficial for a strong economic recovery, which would benefit trades union members and their families.
If we move, Mr. Johnson, from the slightly more general to the more specific, an issue on which you may recall a similar difference of view between unions, education unions in particular, and government, was on the issue of masks in schools. And in the summer of 2020, if you recall, education unions were generally advocating guidance requiring masks in schools. Government policy was permissive guidance in communal areas, and Scotland and the World Health Organization took a different approach. If we have on screen 283369 and page 41, we'll see a text message exchange between you and Dominic Cummings and Lee Kane, and at the very bottom we see 25th of August, a message, a WhatsApp from you. You say, I'm on a train trying to make sense of our totally fucked up face mask policy. And then if we just hold that in our minds, Mr. Johnson, in terms of your assessment of the face mask policy in schools, if we go to 48313, page 53, we see some messages from the following day with Lee Kane again, Mr. Cummings again, and this time Mr. Case. And at the top, Mr. Cummings asks, in language with which we've become familiar, what's the true reason for the U-turn on masks? We just slow catching up. WHO and Scotland bounce. Gavin fucked up. PM dithering ? And then Simon Case, your soon-to-be Cabinet Secretary, offers an explanation. And point 5 is weeks ago, we recommended to PM that we create permissive guidance around masks because we could foresee it was going to be a drama in September. Gavin discussed it at a COVID committee meeting. Because at that stage it was unions pressing for masks, no science backup. Gavin was in no surrender mode and didn't want to give an inch to the unions, so said we should hold firm. PM gave him full support in this approach. And then in his conclusions, his third conclusion is, at every turn, PM backs bullshit no surrender ideas from Hancock, Williams and Shapps, and then totally regrets it later. Mr. Johnson, when it comes to consultation with, working with unions, do we see here the proof in the pudding, in that we have a policy that you obviously saw as wrong-headed, arrived at further to being pointlessly oppositional with unions?
No, the reality is that the advice on masks, as the inquiry knows very well, the position on masks changed during the pandemic, and the advice initially from Chris and particularly from Patrick was that masks were thought to be of limited benefit. They might be thought to be of some symbolic benefit. That changed as the scientists thought that in the end it was a powerful signal to people to wear a mask, that you were taking precautions and that you felt that the virus was still something that was very dangerous. And there were also, as time went on, there was more evidence about droplet spray and so on, and the potential of masks to interrupt transmission. So what you're seeing there in that exchange is the natural political result of a change in advice and a change in understanding of the virus, eventually bringing about a change in policy, and that's what you'd expect.
Mr. Johnson, is what we're seeing here, in fact, quite simply what's on the page, in that you describe, well, I'm not going to repeat your words, but a wrong-headed mask policy. There's then an exchange with... Mr. Johnson, I mean, if you're going to dispute that, I will repeat it. Your phrase was totally...
Mr. Jacobs, you're running out of time, so do you want to pursue this? I think you've got an answer.
I think the adjective I used, which I won't repeat, was intended to convey my sense that a mask policy which had been in position 1 was going to have to change because of changing scientific advice and changing appreciation of the value of masks, and that was the reality. It was going to be politically difficult to execute, but we were going to have to do it.
Mr. Johnson, I'll try and deal with my final and different topic very quickly. You've described your concern as to lockdown hitting the poorest. Do you think it's right to say that self-isolation also hit the poorest hardest? And was it understood by you that financial support for self-isolation was one way of mitigating the unequal impacts of the pandemic?
Yes, and well, that's why we had not just the £500 self-isolation payment, but also we increased universal credit by £1,000, working family tax credit by £1,000, and gave councils a very large budget to deal with those who are most in need of help.
Finally, if that's the case, Mr. Johnson, why was it not until the end of September before that payment to which you refer was introduced?
Because for the reasons I think that we discussed earlier, I was anxious. We spent a huge amount supporting the country already through the pandemic. I was anxious about some of the distorting effects of payments to isolate. We discussed the punitive approach, but eventually I thought, well, we better go with some more support as well, and we did.
My lady, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. Now, Mr. Stanton is hiding in that corner. I can see him. Mr. Johnson, he chose to sit over there. I was put over there, so don't worry. He's used to seeing her back, because we need you to face towards the microphone, Mr. Johnson. Sorry.
I will.
So if you address your answers to me, then.
Yes. Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon, Mr. Johnson. I'd like to ask you a question on behalf of the British Medical Association about the removal of legal limits on social contact during the summer of 2021, which has been described as Freedom Day. Right. In his witness statement to the inquiry, Professor Philip Bamfield, the current chair of the BMA, raises concerns about the government's framing of the removal of restrictions in the context of freedom, which sent the wrong message that the threat of the virus had been fully contained. And in Sajid Javid's witness statement, he states that by late autumn and early winter of 2021, many people felt that the pandemic was over, only for protective measures to be needed once again on the 8th of December 2021 in response to the emergence of the Omicron variant, which you've discussed earlier with Mr. Keith. Mr. Johnson, the question is, to what extent do you think that this mistaken belief that the pandemic was over was influenced by government messaging which framed the removal of public health protections as freedom?
Well, I accept people are going to quarrel with some of the language that we chose, and I have a massive respect for the BMA. But I think if you look at the curve of the pandemic and where we are and where we were then in that period of July 2021, what was to go on, the subsequent movement of the epicurve, I think it wasn't an irrational choice of expression. We had been able to get a huge amount of resistance into the arms of the British public, but I think by that stage, vaccinated all the elderly and vulnerable. It was an amazing achievement, and I didn't think it was an inappropriate way to talk about it. And as I said in my answer to the gentleman from the TUC, I was concerned that we were going to remain too cautious for too long. I think we needed to understand that we'd achieved a great deal, and that if it wasn't quite the end, it was at least the beginning of the end.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Could I just ask quickly in follow-up? Accepting that the slogan Freedom Day wasn't a government communication strategy, but once it had taken hold in public consciousness, do you think more should have been done to counter that belief, having regard to the need for a precautionary approach?
Honestly, no.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Thank you, my lady.
Mr. Keith, that complete. Mr. Alban, no questions that you wish to add? No. That completes the evidence for today. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Johnson. I know how difficult it must be to have 2 days giving evidence.
No, I'm rather sad that it's over because I wanted to. Yeah, please.
No, I was.
I may not see you again, so I just wanted to say one thing, which is that I do think all the testimony and the evidence is incredibly valuable. But I do hope that at the end of all this, there's a few things in particular that I hope that the inquiry will be able to think about, and not just the governmental stuff that we've discussed exhaustively in this module. But I do think that when you come to, I think the issues of health and social care are absolutely critical. And the government that I led was embarked on a big programme to try and bring them together. I think the fact that we had those delayed discharge patients was very, very difficult in the NHS. I hope that this inquiry will give a kick to the powers that be to make sure that we really address that.
Don't worry, we have specific modules both on health and on social care.
And as final point, I absolutely promise you, I do think that, I know it's outside your scope, but I do think that the British public and future governments will need to be elucidated about exactly how this thing originated. And I think even if you can't, and I don't think you can look into it, the inquiry can look into it yourselves, but some sort of prod to the world to get the answer to the real origins of COVID, I think is going to be very, very important.
Mr. Johnson, you set my terms of reference, so I'm afraid I can't
all I'm asking you to do is encourage others.
Right, thank you very much. 10:30 on Monday.
You're right.